Hello, everyone. Welcome to Subtle Asian Book Club's book discussion of We Are Not Free by Traci Chee. We are so lucky to have her with us today. My name is Tiffany at Read by Tiffany.
I'm Alexandra at Twirling Pages. And Traci, do you want to introduce yourself and your books?
Sure. I'm Traci Chee. I wrote We Are Not Free, which is a young adult historical fiction. And then I'm also the author of these ones over here, The Reader, the Speaker, and the Storyteller, which are young adult fantasies set in a world where pretty much no one can read, except for some people can read, and that gives them magical powers. Shenanigans ensue, people die, hopefully you cry. That's that series. And then up next year, I've got another young adult fantasy, 1,000 Steps Into Night, coming out. And that is kind of a mix of Japanese influenced folklore and American feminism all mushed into one.
Yeah. That sounds amazing. And you're like, I hope like you might cry with your other books. Like we cried during We Are Not Free. As a quick little icebreaker before we jump into more serious questions, what has been like your favorite quarantine hobby that you've been doing so far?
Oh dear. What are hobbies? I don't know. I've been watching a lot of Star Trek Discovery lately. But as the weather warms up, I'm going to go back into gardening. I gardened for the first time last year during quarantine, and it was wonderful. I grew an artichoke.
Ooh.
I know. So
was it tasty? Did you make something out of it?
I made a steamed artichoke, which is like my favorite way to eat them. It's just like steam them, dip them in mayonnaise is how I always ate them growing up.
Sounds delicious and also very healthy.
Yeah, and organic because I grew it myself, which is cool.
Yes, very, very local.
Yeah.
I feel like if I tried to grow something, it's just not going to work out.
Well, I mean, we might have time this year. That's how I felt last year. I normally am a plant killer, but grew an artichoke.
We did it, man. Okay. Should we dive right in?
Yes, and if you are here for the discussion, please be aware that we will very likely be diving into spoilers. So if you have not read the book, we suggest you go read it, then come back and watch this when you have your free time.
Yes, we will be going into spoilers, all that jazz. Okay. Let's start with the first question. Oftentimes in Asian families, children aren't always told about like difficult historic background, such as what is talked about when We Are Not Free, all the Japanese internment, everything is sad. Did you experience this? Do you know about it beforehand? And how did you learn about your grandparents being forced into incarceration camps?
Yeah, so as I mentioned to both of you before, I love this question because you hit the nail on the head. The incarceration was not something that my family talked about, at least not to me while I was growing up. And so this big thing, this 3-year-long, huge, life-altering thing had happened to my great-great-grandparents and my grandparents who were teenagers at the time. I just didn't know. They didn't say anything. They were angry and they didn't say anything. So I didn't find out about it until I was 12 years old. And the only reason I found out about it was because at that time, the San Francisco Unified School District was deciding to award these honorary diplomas to people who should have graduated from their schools if they had not been forcibly evicted and then sent to incarceration camps. And so one of those people was my grandfather. And they did this whole big ceremony at like the San Francisco Civic Center, which I don't super remember. And I don't super remember learning that much about what it was like in the incarceration either. What I do remember was that my grandpa was interviewed in the newspaper, the San Francisco Chronicle. And in that article, he had this quote. And the quote was, "Where were the bleeding hearts in 1942? And this is the quote that stuck with me because I was like, "Mom, what's a bleeding heart? I don't really get it." And she was like, "Oh, a bleeding heart is someone who cares about someone." I was like, okay, but why is he so pissed about it? why is he so angry about it? Like, this was 55 years after it happened. And even I, not knowing like the bleeding heart idiom, could tell that it had just stayed with him, like this bitterness and this anger. And so that was my first introduction to the incarceration. And as I grew up, I just learned more and more about it. But always that anger stayed with me.
We think it's so, or I personally think it's so interesting that you mentioned it was through like that award that the San Francisco School District was doing, because even within our existing school system, like we don't really talk that much about it. We were like kind of joking in our like discussions as a book club that we spend so much time in history classes on like Mesopotamia for like 2 months. And granted, like that's important for sure. But then when you go into like your history classes about Japanese internment, it's usually just like a small section in a textbook, or it's very glossed over very quickly, which I personally found very like upsetting, especially because like we both grew up, or Alexandra and I grew up in a very, we both grew up in like East LA. So it's like very like densely populated with Asians. So the fact that this wasn't really even stressed in our specific school districts was pretty darn shocking. So we're really glad that we have books like this coming out that really, really teaches us and like inspires us to learn more about the history. So do you want to talk a little bit about what the research process was like when you were writing this book? I'm sure you probably like referenced your grandparents a lot. Was there anything that was like really difficult about it, or anything that was extremely rewarding?
Yeah, so the research process for this book was like, it took my whole life, right? From like 12 years old, and then gradually kind of hearing, an anecdote here from my Uncle Mickey, which is the one about getting shouted out of an ice cream store, or like reading Farewell to Manzanar or Journey to Topaz. Just like little bits here and there, until my mom and my aunt took me on what's called a pilgrimage out to the Topaz incarceration campsite. And pilgrimages are generally for, camp survivors or descendants of camp survivors, although now I think it's becoming more broad as people are becoming more interested in it. And so that happened when I was 22. We took this drive across the Nevada desert all the way to Utah. And so kind of being out there in this square mile of desert where all that was left is the barbed wire, the original barbed wire is still out there, and these concrete foundations was so formative for me, because you could feel it, how people might have felt being dropped here out of nowhere, just uprooted from San Francisco or LA, which was so different, right, from this big fat nothing that was out there. And so I had this really distinct memory of standing on the concrete foundations of my grandpa's old barracks and looking out at these really, really distant mountains. They were kind of blue in color. They were beautiful, but I was like, these are not my mountains. I am a California girl, and so my mountains are the Sierra Nevadas. And these were just they felt foreign, and I just was thinking about how for 3 years, right, he woke up every day, saw these foreign mountains, and knew that they weren't his. And so that was hugely impactful for me. And after kind of that experience, going to see one of the incarceration sites, as I started to do the research in earnest for this book, I also went to Manzanar Historic Site, which is in California, within driving distance of LA. So if you get a chance after the pandemic is over and we're allowed to go places, I highly, highly recommend it, because Manzanar has a really amazing museum set up there. And also it's beautiful. It's on the backside of the Sierras, so you get to see the mountains. I went to the Japanese American National Museum in LA in the Little Tokyo neighborhood, which is also incredible. Right across the street is a Go for Broke History Museum that's specifically about the 442nd Regimental Combat Team and MIS. I went to Tule Lake, and I didn't get even to the most important part yet. I started interviewing my relatives in 2016, because my grandpa and my grandma on my mom's side had passed away by then. My step grandpa had passed away by then. And so I knew it was time was running out to get these stories from my family. And so my mom and I just took this road trip where we went through and just said, can you tell us what it was like? What was your day-to-day life like? Can you remember anything in particular? What did you think when this particular event happened, or when you got the kind of the notices? And so, boy, that was beautiful and powerful. And I'm so, so glad I did it, because those stories, again, really, really informed so many of kind of the little daily details that kind of make it into We Are Not Free. I think I answered your question. But if I didn't, please feel free to ask again.
No, I totally agree. That was it felt like, I think because you got to interview a lot of your relatives, all of the characters in We're Not Free felt really, really fleshed out and very real. It was like, I am suddenly transported to this time and I'm like experiencing it, because in many ways it was like real and it did happen. I know online on your YouTube you shared like a couple of like cute and fun stories, even though like this book in general is just really sad. But was there anything surprising about yourself or your family that you found through the research process?
Yes. And oh my gosh, thank you for bringing up more family stuff and how real the characters felt to you. And I'm so glad. And so much of that came out of another research thing that I forgot to mention. My grandma, who was 13 when she went into the camps, and got out at 16, so she was like a young teenager, kept all of these letters that boys, and mostly boys, had sent her from her time in the camps. And so a bunch of those were from my grandpa. And so reading my grandpa's letters and like finding out, like, oh, this is what they were interested in, right? They cared about listening to the radio, and they cared about, who was going out with who. And there's this one line from one of my grandpa's letters where he's like, oh, I heard so-and-so gave this other person a strawberry sundae.
It's so cute.
And I immediately went like, oh, this must be very dirty. But then I thought, it was the 1940s. It can't be that dirty, right? So yeah, like a lot of those little moments of joy that you mentioned, I really wanted to include in here, because it wasn't all bad all the time. It was unjust, certainly all the time, but they were kids trying to live their lives, resilient kids. And so they had moments of joy and partying and stupidity, just like anybody else. And those letters actually were kind of one of the most surprising and my favorite things from this research, because my grandma and grandpa did not get together until he left camp. He was drafted into the Army in 1945. So about, 6 to 8 months before the war ended. Oh no, less than that, because he wasn't drafted until April. So much less than that. But he was drafted in the Army. The first letter he sends is like, oh, thank you for the candy, but it means nothing, okay? We're just friends. And then like that starts it off. And then even though they're supposed to be like just friends, he keeps writing her. And like soon he's writing her like 12-page letters, 16-page letters. He was writing her like multiple times a day and like sending just these multiple letters in a row. And so it takes months for him to be like, okay, I forget what the quote is. He's like, I guess I'll say it. Like, I like you an awfully lot.
This is so cute. I'm dying.
Right? I got to watch it feels like I got to watch my grandparents fall in love, and to see kind of the origin of their love story, which lasted their entire lives, was so precious to me. So yeah.
Oh my god, I love that. Well, I'm just like always a big sucker for a love story. So like the whole time you're telling that, I was just like, oh my god, my heart is gonna combust.
Yeah.
But also that just reminds me of like I think it was like there's Twitchy and also Frankie within the books, like writing love letters to like having their own little romance stories. And I think that's what makes your book so powerful, because even though we get to see all these big events that are happening, we get to see their like daily lives of just falling in love, being teens, like being like your grandma from 13 to 16. That's like a very formative age period where you become like a much different person. You grow so much as an individual. So getting to see all of that and getting that incorporated into the books was so powerful.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm so glad. Yeah, the character of Betty in chapter 4 is like that character is loosely inspired by my grandma, who I feel like she just treated camp like a big party, even knowing what it was. You know, she wanted to have her life, and she got it. She made sure she got it. And so, yeah, those moments of joy were really important to me, because even as like we talk about these hard things, I hoped that the book wouldn't just elicit pity, right? Or just elicit these negative feelings. It felt really important to me to kind of go into all of these different aspects of it. Like, yeah, it was sad. Yeah, people were angry. Yeah, people were happy and fell in love and like, you know, did some underage drinking, right? Like it was important to me to try and give these different sides of what was a really complicated event.
Yeah, what I feel was really especially powerful about We Are Not Free is that, like, oftentimes POC authors and, like, POC stories, we are kind of burdened to tell our trauma or, like, sell our, like, hardships, and you were able to, like, have light and also talk about things that are hard. So it was, like, just all in all.
Honestly, like even though I was crying at like the very obvious sad scenes, I think the first time I started tearing up and being like a mess was the second chapter where it wasn't Moss, it was the other. It wasn't Moss, it wasn't Minnow, it was Shig. I was trying to keep track of all the characters in my head. When Shig is like giving out the little origami and you described it as like a parade to the little kids, I was like, I'm crying. Because it was so much joy out of like such a terrible situation.
Yeah. That chapter was hard for me to write because, right, Gaman is such an important concept in thinking and the literature about the incarceration, and I wanted to touch on it. But, you know, that anger again, right? My grandpa's anger again. And I was like, how can I write about Gaman when I'm still so angry about it? Like, how can I turn this into something that feels dignified, right? Or like resilient. I don't know. And so Shig's chapter, which is inspired by a photo of my grandpa, actually, as he was sitting on the steps across from the civil control station as his neighborhood has moved out all around him. That was a chapter where I was grappling with that, as well as I kind of imagined my grandpa was grappling with it at the time too.
So We Are Not Free is, I believe, your first historical fiction book. How is this process? And you kind of touched upon this a little bit, like different from writing your other books. And you mentioned how you were kind of like, this was a story that was in progress ever since you first learned about it from your grandparents. So I'm also a little curious, like, why wasn't this one the first book that you put out? It took a little bit of time.
Yeah, so I never thought that I would write just like a straight up historical fiction, actually. I've always loved magic and fantasies and science fiction. That's like what I read all through elementary school and middle school and high school, and still what I gravitate towards right now. And so The Reader was kind of the first book that came to me and said, like, I am the one that you have to finish. I am the one that you have to actually write and get out there. And so writing that story, a fantasy adventure story starring a girl who looked like me, was really important for kind of, I think, me making a statement as like the kind of author that I wanted to be. I wanted to write for, you know, me as a kid who read a lot of fantasies with white people, and I could empathize with them. And so now people have to empathize with Safia in The Reader. And then, yeah, and so I thought I was going to write another fantasy after that trilogy wrapped up. But then it was the Trump era. And I felt like I had to. It felt like the time, and I have to thank my literary agent for kind of giving me the nudge. I was like, I'm thinking of writing this book about the Japanese American incarceration. And she was like, yes, do that one. I don't care what else you thought you were going to do. This is the time. Do this one now. It's the book of your heart. And I was like, okay. And she was right. She was absolutely right. I thought originally that it was going to have some magic in it. But then as I did all of this research and kind of started putting it together, I was like, for me, putting magic in felt like a disservice to the actual history. And I didn't want to do that. It was really important to me to be as respectful to the details, right? All of these little details that I found in my research, to let people know that those were the truth. You know what I mean? Instead of like, oh, and now there's a magic thing. I didn't want to distract. So, yeah.
Makes sense. And yeah, I understand what you mean about like adding magic, because then like it just feels like not real. Because a lot of times, like even sometimes when reading stuff like this, you're like, I can't believe this happened. How is this real? But now it feels like even more real. So usually books with diaspora experiences usually focus on like one character and one point of view, but We Are Not Free has a huge cast of characters and I love all of them. I cannot choose my favorite. I love all of them. But why was it so important for you to have all these different perspectives and voices of the US Japanese diaspora?
So where did this came from? I think originally, as I was doing this research, as I was interviewing my relatives, and I had relatives who were living in Japantown, San Francisco, like most of the characters. I had relatives who were living out in farms in the Sacramento Valley. I had a relative who was from a very, very poverty-stricken family in LA, actually, and his family were migrant workers, and sometimes they didn't have enough to eat. Like that's how dire the straits were for them. And all of these experiences felt so important to talk about because I hadn't heard many of them before. And I was like, I don't know how to do this with just one. Like, how could I possibly choose which one of these to focus on when they all feel equally urgent and equally important? And then I thought, well, maybe I don't have to do just one. And I know that was a risk because people are used to seeing, just a novel following one character or a handful of characters that you see kind of over and over again. And I decided not to do that. I really wanted to try and get that sense of like, this is a kaleidoscopic story. This is a story where you're going to see one character for a little bit, and then we're going to turn the kaleidoscope, as it were, and we're going to see another character, and that original character is going to be in the background a little bit. We're going to turn it again and see someone else, someone new, to get the feeling of like, this is a story that affected a community, not just one person, and that community was multifold. It was so diverse, even within, the Japanese American community, because we had, people from California, people from Oregon, people from Washington, people from Alaska, although I didn't get to touch on that. And so like none of their experiences could have been the same. And so it was important to me to treat kind of this story as like my way of saying we are not a monolith. We are different, even if we're all Japanese American, right? In this case, we're gonna be different. We're gonna have different reactions, and we are hopefully going to resist categorization and stereotyping. And so that was absolutely part of the project as well.
Yeah,
I think the writing style of like the 14 different characters, I believe, was honestly the perfect way for this book to come to life. Like we were talking about, like, oh, some people were like, I thought that I would get confused, but honestly, like each person stood their own ground. And I think what stands out the most is that we get to see this like group of friends, but that's only just like 14 possible perspectives out of so many people during Japanese like incarceration that could have been affected. Like each person, like I think when we hear about history things like this, like especially in like history books, it gets very like data based. It gets very like, this is what happened. Here's some numbers. Like it was a really bad thing. Next chapter. But here we get to really see them like day-to-day lives, their relationships with their family, their relationships with each other, and then what happens when they're all like broken apart. And I just love this book. I don't really know where I was going with that, but it was just like so like daunting to read, or not daunting, but it was like so jarring.
Yeah, it was a risk. I'm so glad that this came across to you. Like it feels like the things that I really wanted to come out for readers did come out, and so that makes me so happy.
Yeah.
Did you have a favorite character that you were writing, or did you have one that was like, oh, this one's like the most difficult, I like struggled with this one?
Yeah, they were, let's see. Twitchy's story came out almost fully formed. That one just kind of flowed, and I love him, but he's so unlike me. I'm really, really in my head, very intellectual all the time. And Twitchy's like, I don't know, here we go, right? He's just kind of like running around and playing jokes. And so it was a huge surprise to me. And also I haven't been in combat, and like, real life military combat was daunting. But that one just, gosh, it just came out of me. And so the version that you read in the final is almost exactly what it was like in the first draft. I would say I struggled a bit with Yum Yum, actually, who is ironically a lot more like me. And so with her, she came at a point in the story where I felt like she's the one who gives us our introduction to the temporary detention centers, and she's having a very hard time with with kind of her dad being gone and her mom being sick, and her being kind of like the sole character for her little brother. And I kept trying to slip magic into it. I was like, this needs a little bit of spice. What if she turns into a demon at night? And so like so that was a real struggle, and I had to like keep bringing myself back and be like, no, it's not this book. She's not a demon. It's like, pull back on the demony stuff. It's enough that she is just rebelling. Like it's enough that she is taking this opportunity to rebel, and be someone who she wasn't before. And so she was a big struggle for me.
Twitchy's death was a huge turning point in the book, and it was like a yeah, it was so much. I was like, I had to pause and be like, oh, continue. Next chapter, everyone's like reading the letters are coming, and you're like, no,
you're like, I am not okay. For some reason, whenever I like look at the title, it's like We Are Not Free, but whenever I was referencing it, I kept thinking the title was We Are Not Okay, because I was like, I am not okay.
So I was like, we're not okay. But was his character arc what you planned from the beginning, or was there something about his character that kind of made you choose him to have his conclusion over others?
So this kind of goes back to the weird structure of the book with like 14 different characters. And I decided pretty early on, I think after Shig's chapter, I was like, what I'm going to do is use each chapter to give readers a window into a different aspect of the incarceration. So one is about the racism before they're evicted, one is about the eviction, one is about the temporary detention center, and so on and so on and so on. And so once I picked all of those moments, one of them for me had to be the 442nd Regimental Combat Team in Europe, and specifically the Lost Battalion, the rescue of the Lost Battalion, because that battle, that days-long battle, felt so seminal, right? To at least in my research, it felt so seminal to kind of the identity of that combat team. And so I was like, well, it's not a lot of people made it out of there. And so I knew someone was going to die. And I was thinking about who it could be out of the boys who would, volunteer. So Moss, Frankie, Twitchy. And I got this piece of writing advice, I think from Donald Moss, who wrote Writing 21st Century Fiction, although I think this piece of advice is from The Emotional Craft of Fiction. And he said, if you are going to kill someone off in a book, make that person so in love with life. And
I'm not okay.
well, that's twitchy. That's gotta be twitchy, right? He's a character who loves life so much. Even while he's there in the middle of a war, he's finding these moments of joy and laughter and fun. And so I was like, well, he's gonna be the most devastating to lose. And so he had to be the one, right? He had to be the one.
I'm legitimately tearing up right now.
Oh yeah.
One of our commenters said that they assumed it would be Moss because he felt like a glue. And I honestly thought it was going to be Moss too before we figured out it was Twitchy.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he was another option, right? Because he has this arc of, at the beginning, we only see him from Minnow's perspective, and Minnow thinks like, he's so perfect. Oh, he's so hard on me. He wants, and so I see him from this younger brother's perspective. And then even as we go along, once we get to Frankie, Frankie's like, Moss is still, he's so perfect. He's what did I call him? Like Japanese Captain America or something?
Yes.
He's just the guy, the ideal, Japanese American boy. But then I felt like I wanted to give him his fair shot of like telling us who he really was. And so I gave him the chapter as the 442nd is training at Camp Shelby, as he is questioning all of this stuff that he's been brought up to believe, especially by his dad, and trying to live up to these ideals of like what it means to be like a good Japanese American or like a good immigrant. And he's at this moment of breakdown. And I thought it would be a lot to have him breaking down and then also in the middle of a war. And so I gave him his breakdown earlier. And then later on, there are hints that he also got PTSD from that battle as well. So yeah, poor boy. I feel bad for him too.
Going back to Twitchy, you said that like the most impactful death is like the one who is like super like loving life, and Twitchy was definitely that. I remember just reading his chapter and he was like, I don't want to die. Like seeing one, was it Bob? Was his name Bob or Bill? One of his friends also like gets shot during the war, and it just hurts so much because it helps you like remember that these people are children at the same time. They're like fairly young going into this, but like what Moss describes, it's like they're trying so hard to prove that they're not the enemy. It's really that complex part of they're so far removed from being from like Imperial Japan at the time, but people still don't view them as American enough. Like I think Alexandra and I, we're posting like a quote on our Instagram and we were like debating which quote to pick. And the one that I was like really gung-ho for was like, we could do everything right, but they would still hate us or something along those lines.
Thank you. Yeah, that line actually, that's from Minnow's chapter, right? As he is kind of being stalked down the street by these white boys. And as I was writing this, I was thinking a lot about, yes, this happened to kind of my family, and it has happened is happening right now to Asians in this country. But at the time I was thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement and these young Black boys who could do everything right. I'm sorry, who could do everything right? And they would still be seen in this racist, destructive way. And so putting that line in there was like homage to kind of my history, my family history. And then also I wanted to point out like this is still happening all around us right now today.
Yeah, definitely was such a there were so many lines in this book that was so powerful and really stood out to us. So for Minnow in particular, he's actually the only character who has 2 chapters from his point of view, POV. Was there something about him that resonated with you that you like made you want to sandwich the whole story between his perspectives?
Once I started out with him kind of as this observer, as this artist who's just kind of, he's a little bit passive in the beginning, standing back and kind of watching what's happening. It felt like a good conclusion to see where he lands in the end, how this experience has changed him, and in the way that he sees himself kind of walking these San Francisco streets, and also the way he sees this place that he's always thought of as home, but doesn't quite feel like home anymore, right? So having kind of him to bookend this story felt like the right thing to do, instead of giving us someone else at the end. It would hopefully give us a sense of an arc, like the way a regular novel would.
Yeah, it was like you get to see him grow up, essentially, because Minnow is also really young, and he's also the youngest of his family. So like seeing him go back to San Francisco and like seeing that it's not home anymore was like more sadness to the end already, like really taxing like last quarter of the book. But it was a perfect ending. I loved it.
It also sent like that message of him and his family experiencing racism both like before and after the war, even when everything's technically like finished.
Yeah, the work isn't done, right? Not for him, and hopefully I hope readers think like, oh, also the work is not done for us either.
Yeah. Your book touches a lot about the conflicting, paralyzing identity for Japanese Americans, especially during this time. Like with the Loyalty Questionnaire, that was a big part of the book. Do you want to talk a little bit about how the conflict impacts each character? Because I believe every single character kind of like touches about it a little bit.
Yeah, so the so-called Loyalty Questionnaire, as I was planning out kind of what events I wanted to touch on, the Loyalty Questionnaire was definitely one of them, because it was so fundamental in kind of what happened to this community, and kind of what I feel was a fracturing of the community. And so I wanted to have these characters also experiencing that fracturing at the same time. And so I feel like the Loyalty Questionnaire brought up, right, that anger, and also this confusion, and also it pit this community against each other. As I was reading kind of these old newspapers from in camp, the Topaz Times, I was reading the proclamation that the army sent out before, like, hey, we're going to do this questionnaire and here's why. And their reasoning was like, not all Japanese Americans are loyal to the United States. Some among you are troublemakers. Like, some among you are disloyal. And so kind of just the way that it was framed of like, we've got to ferret out the bad ones, like the bad Japanese people. Right. It set this stage for like, you can't choose what you actually choose. You can't be complicated, which these kids are like, they're trying to be people, right? They're trying to be complicated. And then of course, you know, with having to have your answers only be yes and yes, or no and no, with like no yes but, or no yes and, no anything like that. It flattened, like the Loyalty Questionnaire tried to flatten people into like, you're good or you're bad, you're with us or you're against us. And that it drove, to me, it feels like it drove this wedge into this community. That there was this external force kind of bearing down on the bonds of friendship and family, in a way that I feel like institutions still do now, right? Still try and pit us against each other. And so I forget the rest of the question. I'm sorry, I got all fired up about the Loyalty Questionnaire.
Do you want to? Yes, we'd love to hear it. But do you want to talk about how it connects to each character?
Yes. Okay. So some of them, right? Some of them were old enough. They were 17, so they got to answer. And that's kind of what Stan is kind of going through in his chapter. Am I going to say yes or am I going to say no? Am I going to break apart my family or not? And so Stan ends up being only one of two so-called no-nos in the group, him and Tommy's family. And everybody else says yes and yes. And I feel like it was hard for them, right? Like I feel it was difficult. And for Stan, I mean, he had just witnessed that shooting, which it did change for fiction, right? It happened a little bit earlier in the book than it did in real life. And
but it still happened.
Yeah, it happened to a man named James Wakasa, who was age 63 when he was shot and killed in April of 1943. And then Tommy's reasons were different, right? Tommy's reasons were like, I don't believe this, but I have to say no and no in order to keep my family together, in order to not separate us, because who knows how else they'll separate us after this, you know? And so they were the kind of the two ones who answered no and no, and then everybody else said yes and yes for various reasons. Twitchy, Moss, and Frankie wanted to fight. Shig, I feel like, was going to go with whatever Moss did, you know? Excuse me. And then Betty and Yum Yum are pretty, I think, American, right? In their feelings.
Their wigs.
Yeah. And then I have a perspective later on from Mary, who didn't get to make her choice, right? And I felt like that was important to touch on too. You know that feeling of like when you're a kid and you have opinions and you feel like you know who you are, and yet you don't have the power to change your situation. And so I really wanted to kind of touch on that as well from Mary's perspective.
Yeah, I loved how the book kind of showed there were people who said yes because that was like what they wanted. They like that's what they believed in. Some of them were still like uncertain with the whole like we're fighting a war for them, but they still don't believe us. And then we get the no-nos, and the fact that like they all get uprooted again to like a different internment camp that's more like, I guess, high security and more like for the bad ones, which was just very shocking. Well, not shocking, but like so devastating to read at the same time.
Yeah, the two Lake chapters were difficult to write because it was so much worse there than it was in Topa. Worse is relative, but they had higher fences. They had, you know, more intense security. They were under a period of martial law for a while. They had food shortages, so it was bad. It was bad there. But I had grandparents who were there as well, and so I wanted to touch on that if I could.
No, like all of it as I read out. As I was reading, I was just like, I just wish that we could see even more stories or like more of what else is out there. Because you also get the perspective. So for example, like Yum Yum's father, who's completely gone, taken by the CIA. We don't really hear too much about like what that experience is like. And you can only imagine that it's like much worse. And it was just very devastating to read about. But your book touches a lot. Oh, I'm sorry. Do you want to say something?
I was gonna give a recommendation. AMC a couple of years ago did this horror TV show called The Terror, and their second season is set during this time period in the Japanese American incarceration camps, and some of the characters are sent to a Department of Justice camp. There is a horror element to it, but if you are interested in kind of seeing other perspectives and hearing other stories and you like horror, I recommend checking out The Terror. Another cool thing is that all of the actors that were playing Japanese Americans are of Japanese descent, which I think is really, really cool. So The Terror on AMC.
Yes.
Amazing. So your book focuses a lot on family relationships, romantic relationships, but most importantly, like friendship and community. Do you want to talk a bit about the significance of this community during this entire time period?
Oh boy, I don't know if I can speak to the entire time period.
Oh yeah, that's a lot.
I did want to, I mean, that came out of my grandpa's letters again, right? Because he's always just going on and on about like, oh, so-and-so's in New York now, so-and-so's in Detroit, so-and-so have hooked up, right? It was again and again, it always for him came back to these friends that he had grown up with and these friends that were kind of getting scattered. all over the country and indeed all over the world. And so that to me felt like why it had to be the center of this book, these friendship bonds between these characters. Yeah.
So good. I love yeah. Oh, man, I love this book so much.
We are not okay.
I'm like, I love this book so much. Yeah, but I love how it touches so much on like friendship and also about like relevant things that are still relevant today because like racism and all these other terrible things are still going on. So do you have any advice or like steps that we could do to raise awareness or prevent similar situations from going on or like happening in the future? Like especially now, recently with all the rise of like in hate for Asians in the community and just all these other things. Do you have any advice?
First, I want to say thank you, Tiffany and Alexandra, and thank you to the Subtle Asian Book Club, because I feel like this is a step, right? Like talking about our history, coming together and kind of sharing these experiences, I feel like is a great first step in raising awareness. And then I would say there are plenty of organizations out there already doing the social justice work. And so one of them specifically started by Japanese Americans is Suru for Solidarity, and they work to close down, hopefully one day, ICE detention centers, and then, you know, broader than that, to end kind of the carceral state in this country. There's Detention Watch Now that I've been following. And then I think another Asian American one is called 18 Million Rising. That's another one to watch out for. And so I feel like these groups that are out there are doing the work, and they're doing work in solidarity with other communities that are affected right now. And so that, I think, is where our power is going to lie going forward, is in kind of standing lockstep with other communities as well as our own, and kind of forming those intercommunity alliances. So that is my hope. I would say another thing that's happening right now and is ending in like an hour or so is the Asian Author Alliance is holding the Kidlit Against Anti-AAPI Racism auction fundraiser. And so if you are into books, there are a ton of books available for bidding on, and it's raising funds for two organizations, Stop AAPI Hate and Hate is a Virus, to, you know, combat some of that anti-AAPI racism that's going on our streets right now. And so there's lots of opportunities. I encourage you to go out and find them, because the more I look, the more I find, and I feel that's really encouraging.
Traci Chee's books are also up for auction, so be sure to check those out. We, as a book club, are also auctioning off a Subtle Asian book box where we'll like send you stationery and like snacks and a book of your choice. So you should definitely check both of those items out. And I've just been lurking at all the items. I'm like, everything's so cool, but so much money, but also great cause.
Yeah, I know, that's the thing, right? You're like, oh, $50 for a book, or is it $50 to stop anti-AAPI racism? And that's a pretty cool thing, right?
Exactly. So We Are Not Free is categorized as young adult. Was there a particular reason why you wanted to target the book towards a younger audience versus, say, like an older audience or like an adult audience? And I guess the second part to that question is, do you see yourself writing for an audience outside of YA in the future? And we can go more into that. You can answer the second part later.
Oh, no, I was actually going to answer the second part first.
Oh, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so I kind of was trained through like my undergrad and my grad school writing programs to like write literature, to write adult literary books. And so that's kind of where I was headed until one of my colleagues was like, you write with this really exuberant, energetic voice. Why aren't you writing for kids? And I was like, yes. Why aren't I writing for kids? I mean, like, kids' books are the ones that were so formative for me growing up and are still some of my favorites now. Why am I not doing that? And so when I decided to like, I'm going to give this author thing a shot, I was like, I'm going to give it a shot with writing for young people. I'm going to give it a shot with writing YA. And that's what The Reader came out of. And so I like writing for young people. There is something really exciting about that kind of age where you're figuring out who you are and what you value and what you want to fight for, and you're figuring out kind of your place in the world and what you want the world to be for yourself, right? It's this really dynamic time, and I love writing about it. And also, young people are just cooler. Like, I don't want to knock adults too much, especially because I am one. But like, there is a rigidity to some adults, right, where they resist change. And I don't know that I want to be that kind of adult, or I find it more exciting to write for people who are in the middle of it. And so maybe one day, but I still am drawn to writing for kids and young people.
Yeah, I will read anything you write, but I do love YA because of all the things you said. And also I feel like just this age range, kids in general are just, or not even kids, they're like teenagers, young adults in general are just like more free. They feel like more like ambitious and unafraid, because by the time you get old, you're like, I have responsibilities, I have a job, I have kids, I have like all these other things. But then like when you're like a teenager and you're growing, you're like, anything's possible. And then it's so nice to read that and so nice to see that. Are you working on?
We were also talking about this at like a different live or some. We were talking about this before, but like even with teenagers and those like young adults, a lot of social justice movements, a lot of change that are happening in the world are also being driven by young adults, even though we might like look down on them, like, oh, you don't know any better, you're just a kid. And sometimes it's like, yes, like I'm 16, but like so many movements have come from these like students. Like we were talking a little bit about like Hong Kong, but like Greta, the environmental girl, like so many like amazing things have come out of young like adults, and it's not right to just like look down on them.
Yes, absolutely. And then I would also say young readers, I find, tend to be more adventurous than a lot of adult readers. I was noticing this with the Reader trilogy, where that book has like 8 point of view characters. It's not as intense as We're Not Free, but there are a lot of different point of view characters, and there's 3 timelines going on at the same time. And I found that it's more adults who are like, oh, I don't know about this. I found it slow, or I found it confusing. And I've observed that it tends to be young people who are like, no, I just went with it and it was fine. And I love that kind of reader who's like ready to go on this journey with me. I think that's so cool.
Yeah, we're so excited to go on the journey for whatever is coming out next. Are you working on anything new right now? We know you talked a little bit about your upcoming release, 1,000 Steps into the Night, but is it done? Is it a series? Like,
can we buy it soon?
So 1,000 Steps into Night doesn't come out until March of next year. It's a year, actually, I think a year out tomorrow. I think it's March 1st next year. And so I don't think there are pre-order links yet, but if you keep an eye on my website, tracichee.com, or my social media, where I'm either Traci Chee or Traci Chee Author, because someone took Traci Chee on Instagram and I was so mad. You can hopefully, see what I've got cooking for a pre-order campaign, and I'll let you know when those pre-order links come out. But it is with my editor right now. I turned in a revision at the beginning of February, and she hasn't said anything yet. So I don't know how much more work we've got going, but I am really excited about it. I will tell you, I don't intentionally rip out anyone's heart in that one. I wanted, after We Are Not Free, I wanted to write something that felt more joyous and didn't have like that feeling of like, oh, this is so sad. And so it's a more lighthearted romp, even though there are demons in it. So I'm excited for that one.
Sounds very exciting. So as we come up to like the hour-ish mark, we thought it'd be fun to end things with a speed round with like some fun questions. So do you want to start off by telling your most anticipated 2021 release?
Yes, except this is not speedy because I have a lot and I wrote them down for you. Okay, so first on deck for me is I really want to read Last Night at the Telegraph Club by Melinda Lowe. It just came out. It's gotten so much critical acclaim. She's actually doing an event next Saturday, March 6th. It's virtual with the GLBT History Museum in San Francisco, and they do such amazing work with GLBT history. And so I highly recommend going to check that one out. I'm pretty sure you can also order Last Night at the Telegraph Club through that event. So definitely check that one out. It's historical, set in San Francisco in the 1950s. And then also coming out in March is Ravage the Dark by Tara Sim. Comes out March 9th. It is the sequel to Scavenge the Stars, which is like a YA fantasy Count of Monte Cristo retelling. I just read Scavenge pretty recently, and it's so good, and I really want to find out what happened. So it's Ravage the Dark. That one's out in March. And then there's so many books coming out this year by Asian authors, and so I want to shout them all, and I have more to come. So I really am excited about Seven Crimson Cranes by Elizabeth Lim. That one comes out in July, and it is
the cover is beautiful.
So beautiful, right? That artist also of Asian extraction, which is very cool. I'm very excited about that one with its kind of folklore, like its Asian folklore aspects, I think is really cool. And if you're excited about A Thousand Steps Into Night, I highly recommend checking out Six Crimson Cranes. Broken Web by Lori Lee is coming out in July as well. It's a sequel to Forest of Souls, which is, I think, Hmong-inspired fantasy. The first one was so good, I blurbed it. And the second one is coming out, so I get to see kind of where these characters go. And if you like a female friendship, that was the heart of that book. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing where Broken Web ends up. A Clash of Steel by Phoebe Lee is coming out in September. That one is a Treasure Island remix. I have it in my inbox. So I get to read that one soon, yay. And then finally, The Keeper of Night by Kylie Lee Baker. It's coming out in October. It's her debut, and it is kind of like a paranormal historical fantasy set in 1800s London, starring a character who is a cross between like a London Reaper and then a Japanese Reaper, a Japanese kind of folkloric character as well. And so I'm very excited for all of these. I really hope that you check them out. Asian authored books, man, 2021 is going to be amazing.
Yeah.
We're being fed.
Yeah,
So Asian book club is really so many. There's not enough time. So many books to go around. We're so excited.
So it's like it's such a great curse to have.
Yeah.
So the next question is, what's a book that you would recommend to everyone?
I cannot answer this one. This is a cruel question, and if you've asked it to other authors, you're so mean. There's so many books out there. I can't choose, right? I have to say, I really enjoyed recently Prairie Lotus by Linda Sue Park, and I picked that one because it is middle grade, and so it's accessible to a lot of different people. It's like Asian Little House on the Prairie with a biracial Chinese girl kind of doing her Laura Ingalls Wilder thing, but also kind of dealing with the nuances of racism. And so I really liked Prairie Lotus. But there's no one. There's no one. Come on. There's no one.
All the books you recommended sound so good. I'm like, I'm writing down all this list. Okay. Do you have a favorite Japanese food or favorite food in general? Or you can answer both if they're separate.
Okay. So I'm born and raised in California, and we've gone to like Japanese restaurants my whole life and eaten Japanese food at family gatherings my whole life. I was never super into uni. It just was not my thing until I went to Japan, and I had it there. I had a uni bowl, and it was the most amazing taste I have ever had in my entire life. And it's like it's a flavor that I dream about. It is so sweet and yet so briny and yet so unctuous. And I just like I dream about having that taste in my mouth. And we're in a pandemic, and I can't go back there to try it. I mean, I hate to say it, but like none of the uni that you can get, even in California, compares. It was so good. So I don't know if it's my favorite food, but it's a food that haunts me.
In the best way.
Yes.
Does anybody have any lasting questions for
Yeah.
lovely Traci Chee?
We covered a lot.
Or do you have any lasting words for your readers?
Oh yeah.
Oh boy. No. No, I think like I don't know. I would encourage you to go out there and read, right? There's so much good literature coming out right now. Like I'm reading, maybe I showed you guys earlier, but I'm reading How Much of These Hills is Gold right now. Also Asian authors. I read Interior Chinatown by Charles Yu earlier. That came out last year and won the National Book Award for fiction. It was so good. It was like in the style of a screenplay, which I'd never experienced in a novel before. And so if you've got the opportunity, the Asian American creator community is doing such incredible work right now. And so thank you, Alexandra, and thank you, Tiffany. Thank you to the Subtle Asia Book Club for like contributing to that community. It's very cool. I didn't know it existed for a long time. But to have it here now is amazing.
And thank you again so much for being here today. Honestly, like I could listen to you talk forever. I could listen to your stories and your research forever. If you guys want to hear more about like the research process, Traci does have a YouTube channel where she put up like little snippets of YouTube videos. So you can go back to those. But that is all that I have. That might be all we have.
Yes. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you.
Oh, I think we did have one question.
Okay, one question.
That's a hard question.
That is rough.
From the book and the effects they had on the characters, because you wanted to focus on the camp experience. Thank you for this question. And I think you're referring to the bombs that America dropped on Japan at the end of the war. And oh boy, that was such a huge event in Japanese history. And I didn't know that I could really do justice to it in kind of the scope of a book about the American incarceration camps. And so without knowing that I could touch it with respect and to give it all of the unpacking and complication that it deserves, I didn't feel like I was the right person to tell that story, and especially not within kind of the scope of We Are Not Free. Yeah. So thank you for that question. It didn't feel like the right project for it.
Do you have any like recommended reading if people wanted to like learn more about it, or like the history behind it, or not even history, but like the impact of it?
Let's see. A young adult book came out a couple years ago by, I think the author's name is Birkensaw, called The Last Cherry Blossom Falling, that I think is about the bombing. Nothing else comes to the top of my head right now. But yeah, this is something that I feel like is really important and connected, right? Connected to this history. And so I would love to see someone else tackle that in fiction one day, maybe kind of that connection between the American incarceration camps and this bombing, and to see what kind of stories and resonances there are there. I feel like the best thing for all of us is to get more stories out there, read more, write more, tell more.
For sure. And I'm sure, like, as we can see in the comments, people are so thankful that you wrote this book. Felt so great to be represented in these stories. And just to have these stories told, because honestly, if I did not read your book, I would not have known like the scope of what was going on in terms of incarceration, because like we said before, it's kind of glossed over in US history courses, which is such a disservice to what has happened to the Japanese American community. So sorry for going, like, we're leaving you, but then we came back to a question. But thank you so much, Reese, for asking that question. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Yeah, and thank you, Traci, for joining us. We love having you on.
This was so great. Thank you. Thank you to both of you, and then the whole Subtle Asian Book Club. You're doing great work, and I so appreciate it. Thank you.
Yay, thank you. Okay.
We hope to see you guys next month. In March, we'll be reading Jade City by Fonda Lee. And in April, we're going to be reading The Mountain Sing. For The Mountain Sing, we're part of like the virtual book tour. So if you wanted to pre-order the book through East Wind Books of Berkeley, you will get 10% off as well as a signed book plate from the author. So many exciting things coming up. Both of the authors will be present for those live shows. So if you're not on our Discord, if you're not on our Facebook group, or on any of our social media channels, now is the time to join.
Yay! So exciting. And so many like amazing Asian authors' stories coming out this year. Truly, we are being fed. Okay.
I don't know if I have enough tears to cry.
Oh, yeah.
But it's going to be a great year.
Yeah, it's going to be amazing. Okay.
Thank you all so much again. Bye.
Thank you.